Hello and welcome back to this Downfield Ideas Crusade. This video is a very special Blu-ray review I wanted to do because, of course, there's a lot of hype for this release that was announced late last year, and we've all been waiting with bated breath over whether or not this would, resurrect this film on disc and finally give us a definitive release of this film, which has had a tumultuous video history in both its picture and sound, and the cuts of the film, and the various edits and the reconstructions and the restoration attempts throughout the years. And of course, any Sergio Leone film has this same tumultuous video history. So, of course, I am talking about the brand new 4K and Blu-ray release. Kino Lorber taking their second stab at The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is Kino's second go-round with the film after their 2017 Blu-ray, which took the brand new 2014 master from MGM and tried to address some of the many color issues, but unfortunately wound up causing problems of its own, in addition to presenting a version of the film's international cut that was actually based around the 1998 DVD master, which had problems of its own in its edit. Some of that I will try and go into. I'm trying to make this a nice review that's not too terribly long, but also tries to get into some of the various video versions and the edits of the film, so that way you get a more complete picture and you can decide whether or not you want to pick up this release for yourself, which I will wholeheartedly go ahead and tell you this is a must own, because it does try and fix as many problems as can possibly be done on obviously a limited budget and with a problematic master that already exists. None of this is really Kino's fault. So the fact that they decided to take a second stab at this and really, correct some of their past mistakes, and this time actually reach out to various fans who have really done the lion's share of the work in terms of researching the film's history and seeking out various versions of the film, and actually finding new materials and various print materials and IB Technicolor print materials, in addition to actually using some of that work and using the fans' research this time around, whereas before myself and some of the other guys and a lot of fans wrote into Kino and basically got the shaft in a lot of ways. It really rubbed a lot of us the wrong way. So this is a really unbelievable turnaround. It's admittedly not perfect. It does have some issues of its own, but a lot of that stuff is baked into the source master itself. I will go ahead and preface this review that unfortunately I am not able to review the 4K portion of this, so I am strictly limited to the 1080p portion. But since this 4K disc does not have HDR, and this is a master dating to at least 2014, it obviously did not have HDR input in it as far as we know. So basically the 4K disc, it gives you slight improvements over what you get on the 1080p Blu-ray, but thankfully the Blu-ray included is the exact same new master that Kino has created. Of course, this release is finally presenting the 1967 international release version of the film on disc in its entirety for the first time. The closest we have ever gotten to this beforehand on home video is actually all the way back on the 1990 letterbox Laserdisc, which is the first letterbox version of the film on home video. That was only missing about a handful of shots here and there, but otherwise that was the 1967 international release cut that was supervised by Leone, and that was what was dubbed into English for the 1967 release prints here in the U.S. The original Italian version ran significantly longer, much closer to 3 hours, but is not what was reconstructed by MGM in 2003. That was really their own hybrid cut. It often gets labeled as the long version, but I'll try and get into some of that once we get further into the review. But I just wanted to go ahead and preface that the 4K version on disc here, again, it does not have HDR and is simply giving you slightly better picture and the greater resolution available in 4K, with all of the improvements made to the master by Kino Lorber in the color timing and the all-important resurrection of the film's mono track, which I'll get into. I will put timestamps in the video. So if you just want to skip to the actual disc review itself and the tech specs and everything, and you don't want to hear a giant Sergio Leone nerd babbling on and on and on about this film and disc transfers and stuff, I've done Leone stuff before on my channel, so I'm sure if you've seen my stream on Leone, I definitely have quite a bit to talk about. So I will do a brief run through of the sort of video history, really, at least of just the letterbox edition, so you kind of get an idea of where we've come from and how long it's taken to get to this release and why this release is so important. And then I'll jump into the actual disc review itself in terms of picture, sound, extras, packaging, and all that stuff. I guess first I should talk a little bit more about the cuts of the film and the differences between the international release version from 1967, the original Italian release version in 1966, then there was a different edit for the Rome premiere in 1966. And then, of course, MGM tried not just once, but they did sort of rework the film and the elements they had more than once. The first time was really in 1998 for the final Laserdisc and first DVD, and when they also did their other Leone titles, which also caused some problems on some of the other titles. But then the primary big one in 2003, when they decided to make a extended English language version, bringing in some of those Italian scenes and elements and creating a brand new English track. So again, I'm trying to boil all this down so you can get a greater context. If you're coming in cold, you've always wondered what the differences between the versions are, or why Kino Lorber's new release is specifically the international release version and not the longer version or the 3-hour version that most people have really become more accustomed to, because that's been the version in print really since 2003, when MGM did this extended English language version. So originally in 1966, the film was about 3 hours in Italy, and of course Leone films seem to have different variations come out of the woodworks all the time, but the Italian films would of course be shot primarily silently and then dubbed into whichever language for what countries it was being released in. Then those countries and their censor boards would make various cuts and things, so usually a Leone title, or most Italian westerns really, will vary slightly from country to country in terms of the edits. But anyway, what you see in the Italian release version, it's about 3 hours, and it has all the scenes that are added to the extended English language version, except one, which is the infamous grotto scene. That was apparently shown at the Rome premiere and then immediately removed by Leone himself. It is really not supposed to be in any version of the film. Apparently he didn't even really like it very much himself. MGM took it upon themselves to reinsert that into the film. So roughly what you're looking at with the Italian release version is essentially what we have on the MGM extended version that most people are used to now, just minus that grotto scene. There are other, differences here and there. Some frame differences all over the place. Some shots run a little bit longer, some run a little bit shorter. Again, the edits really vary, but just to get a general idea, the Italian release version is pretty close to what most people are used to with the MGM extended cut, and of course is entirely in Italian in the original mono sound design, just without that grotto scene. Now, of course, that's the version that Sergio Leone produced, signed off on, and when it came time to make the international version and the US version, because of course United Artists had stepped in and financed the film after the great success of the first two Dollars films, and of course they would buy the rights to those and later reissued them. Leone was contractually obligated to provide a relatively appropriate theatrical cut for U.S. markets, and this basically became the international version that was used in all other territories, because United Artists had a fantastic worldwide distribution system, and he came in and made some trims that he really felt were, as with anything, it's hard to lose pieces and elements. And there's, I love some of the scenes from the Italian version and wish they could have stayed in. But he did, later admit that it forced him to be a bit more creative. It focused the narrative a bit more. And that's how we wound up with the 161-minute international version that was released here in the U.S. in 1967. And of course, that was what was dubbed into English by the original actors with the dialogue written by Mickey Knox. That is also why the other sequences were never dubbed into English, because they were not going to be seen in America ever. It's unfortunate they didn't just go ahead and do those as well, but they did not. So that is really the film that everybody knew and loved for many, many years. And that is technically the theatrical release version for not just the US, but most territories throughout the rest of the world. The 161-minute Sergio Leone approved and cut down version. And thematically, stylistically, I really do think it is the stronger film. Most people kind of feel this way now as well. While there are some really great scenes that you do miss from the longer Italian version, it causes the film to be much more focused. And GBU itself, stylistically, has 1 foot in the early dollars films, for a few dollars more, and it's got 1 foot in the later Leone emerging style of Once Upon a Time in the West. So it's right in there between. It's becoming more operatic. It's stretching itself out a little bit. It's taking its time a bit more, but it really does help that greater focus. And there are a number of scenes that I really think are superfluous in the Italian version. So for me personally, I prefer the international release version. So that's basically how it stood until the home video era, and we started getting versions of the international cut because they were just scanning prints and things like that. And the first major release that was properly letterboxed is the 1990 Laserdisc seen here. This is a really nice disc for the time. Again, it's 1990, so it's obviously a bit older, even for LD. This was the first property letterbox transfer, has PCM mono. This is the 1967 international release cut, and until this new Kino release, this was the only proper way to see it. It is missing 1 or 2 shots here and there. It's not 100% perfect. That's probably because the source element they pulled maybe was missing some frames, or they were too damaged or something. And this was really before the advent of digital tools being able to be used in home videos. So it was very much a hands-off type process. They could scan prints, they could do basic cleanup here and there, but they couldn't really do a whole lot outside of that. The mono here is outstanding, and this will come into play a little bit later when I talk about the audio of the Kino disc, but this is the best sounding version of the English mono, with a clarity that is not found on any later releases, again, until we get to the new Kino release, which I will explain why. This has a nice gatefold, and again was a nice MGM disc for the time, but not a fancy special edition or anything. Now, this was reprinted in the much harder to find Trilogy box set that brings together all $3 films, and these are the same LD transfers that you get on the standalone releases, but MGM had a habit of making nice boxes to, get a little bit of savings and stuff. The only major difference is with most LD box sets, what were individual discs before, they do share discs. So, they will, one film will finish and usually go immediately into the other. That way they save sides. But otherwise, the transfer is exactly the same as the standalone with the same outstanding English mono PCM track. This came out a little bit later, I believe, in 1993. Again, it's a lot harder to find than the standalone release, but it is the same transfer. So the only thing with this that's a little weird, the source they use, the iconic freeze frame captions for the characters are actually in Italian. So it is the international cut. It is missing 1 or 2 shots, but the on-screen captions are in Italian for some reason. After this point, MGM really started to, what they would start to do is mix prints to try and create cleaner video masters, which they were already doing at this point. But with the Leone films, it meant that if you weren't careful, you could inadvertently cause editing discrepancies, because different prints with different run times and different shot lengths and things, and you're getting different prints from different countries with different audio tracks, and you have to resync the audio. this is where a lot of the variables started to really ramp up and cause a lot of issues. So until currently, with this new Kino disc, this is actually what I would recommend to people. I'd have to tell them, you have to have a Laserdisc player, but the audio was unbeatable, and it is the proper Leone approved English language version, the international cut. Again, not 100% perfect because it is missing one or two shots, and it is an older LD, but it still holds up remarkably well. And of course, in Laserdisc, just like in vinyl record collecting, a lot of people like to promote or swear by Japanese Laserdisc pressings. Sometimes they can have differences, but for the most part, they usually are the same as the US versions. So, of course, when I had the opportunity, I also picked up the Japanese release of the letterboxed LD. Slightly spiffed up cover art, but this is exactly the same as what we got here in the US. Yeah, this is also 1993, but of course, just to show my dedication to trying any available video version of the Leone titles, I even picked up the Japanese Laserdisc, which is very uncommon. So, getting on to what I mentioned before about MGM starting to mix together various prints of films to try and create a single clean video master element that improved over what came before. In 1998, they did this with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which they also would do with For a Few Dollars More. These were originally designed to be on the Laserdisc format, but this was at the end of the format, and MGM, like a lot of other studios, wound up sort of shifting over to DVD. So we only got The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on a remastered brand new Laserdisc. This is the 1998 LD. Because it is, of course, a late release. It was printed in very limited quantities and is exceptionally tough to find. For many years, I thought this was probably the version I needed to track down with its PCM mono and its a late release LD. It does include this was the point at which they first included the scenes from the Italian version. These are tacked on the end. They have the Italian mono. Unfortunately, they're not subtitled on here. But this was the first time American audiences really saw the additional Italian footage, and it was like, oh wow, what is this? This is amazing. Where did this come from? That's what most people's reactions were. Again, this is very hard to come by, but unfortunately, it does mix together different prints, and it caused some editing discrepancies. So this really should be referred to as the 1998 version of the film. It is not quite the international cut. Of course, most people would look at these two different versions and say, what are you talking about? They seem the same. But there are enough minor discrepancies, different shot lengths and things, and particularly in one sequence, the actual editing of the sequence is changed somehow by the different print sources being mixed together. So again, it's really down to the fact that really it was just seemingly accidental that this happened. But this became the version of the film that most people knew and saw on television airings and saw on home video and rented. So this became the new de facto standard version until 2003. But again, most people were not watching the Laserdisc. Most people had the 1998 DVD shown here with the same artwork, and I always loved the fact that they advertised these as they fit the whole movie on one disc. You don't have to flip it over, because these were early DVD 9s, dual layer DVDs, and this one is the one of the $3 films that's actually anamorphically encoded. I should say anamorphically enhanced. Fistful and For a Few Dollars More were not, unfortunately. I never got the original pressing of this in the box set, which had a little booklet as well, but the disc is simple, but it's always looked nice. But again, this is the 1998 version of the film that does induce those accidental errors and things. And just because it's never easy with Leone, you would think these are exactly the same as is typical for DVDs that port a Laserdisc master. But no, there are one or two shots missing. So the DVD and the Laserdisc are very slightly different. Otherwise, it's the same master. This has mono, but it's lossy encoded, and because it is a longer feature and it's an earlier DVD, the bit rate is on the lower side. The Italian scenes are here as well, and the menu is very very minuscule. and minimalistic because it's an early DVD, but you also get the Italian scenes here. So again, this is what most people bought because it was the early days of DVD, or they bought the Trilogy set with the other $2 films. But again, this should be known and referred to as the 1998 version of the film. Again, it's pretty close to the international cut, but there's enough discrepancies that were caused in the mixing of different elements that this really becomes its own de facto version of the film that is different from the international 1967 release version. And then this is where things get really complicated. In 2003, MGM decided to take it upon themselves to go back and look at their Leone library titles again, and they started planning for special edition releases, which didn't really come to full fruition because the other titles got held up in the States all the way till 2007. They came out in 2005 in Europe. But first, in 2002, they started with the most popular title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and they decided to take all those Italian scenes they had tucked in on the 1998 video releases and try and reincorporate them into the film and do their own brand new restoration process and try and create better prints and create a full-length English language version of the film that incorporated all of the Italian sequences. So this resulted in the 2003 extended English language edition. They did make brand new 35mm prints of this, which I have seen twice, and then the big home video premiere here for the DVD. What this did, though, was it didn't do what you would think and recreate the Italian release version. It has some issues of its own in terms of the edit not being quite right, and it puts that grotto scene back in the film, which again was not in the Italian release version. Apparently was only shown at the premiere, and really should be included as an extra and not incorporated into the film. There's been controversy about that ever since MGM did that. But this is an it's trying to give you an idea of the Italian version, but with a English language track. But again, those extra scenes were never dubbed into English back in 1966-67. So what MGM did was bring in the surviving actors. So Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach came in and recorded the dialogue. And of course, it's very noticeable that they have aged in the intervening years. And a really good voice impersonator for Lee Van Cleef. And it would have been one thing had they just done that and left everything mono, but they fully upgraded to a 5.1 sound mix design, and that meant that they completely refoleyed all of the effects work to add stereo panning and to really make it a modern 5.1 mix for the 2003 era and to really show off the film in people's home theater environments. This is, of course, completely against a archival standpoint and Sergio Leone's intended design for the film, because of course Leone was very involved in the sound design of his films, even though this was still the single channel mono era. Leone's films are iconic for their sound design, and every single sound effect was worried about and enslaved over and painstakingly put in there and supervised by Leone himself. So the brand new Foley work, while it is, trying to make everything modern, it really is one of the worst, if not the single worst, revisionist audio mix ever created. I absolutely loathe this mix with a passion. I've loathed it ever since I first encountered it. It's the fact that it is on a Leone film where the sound was, again, so painstakingly designed for particular effect, and really undoes that effect in many places in the film and really wrecks the sound design. That's why this version's always been very unwatchable for me, because I can't stand what they did to the sound, let alone the edits not being correct. So that's the glaring problem with this release, and has always been so. Outside of the edit, what was interesting is they did sync the Italian mono to this. So when I watched this, I would literally watch it with the Italian mono and just turn on the English subtitles, because I was already that much of a nerd as a teenager. This became the new de facto standard version of the film, taking over from the 1998 version. And this has become known as the extended cut or the full cut, or some people even label it the director's cut, which is a misnomer if there ever was one. But this is now, unfortunately, the version most people are familiar with, and it is really MGM's cut of the film from 2003. Again, they did do good restoration work at the time. The prints they made actually looked quite good. They weren't perfect, and again, it's been quite a while since I've seen it. I saw it back in 2003, before right after the DVD came out, and then I saw it again a couple years ago. And I'm having to go off recollections and things, but that was an attempt to make clearer, sharper prints from the Techniscope process and the negative, which was very tricky to do back in the day because it was a optical blow-up process to convert it to standard 4-perf prints. So using modern technology, sharper modern lenses, the idea is it results in better prints. But that also had the atrocious 5.1 remix, slapped on it, so it made the restoration work practically worthless, I thought. So anyway, this also made the lovely new design. The design and the box art of this has always been really impressive to me, and I still love the packaging of this release, which kind of became the new design style for the films. And of course, eventually when we got the other special editions of the Dollars films and DocuSucker in 2007, had to wait 4 long years to get the other ones, they followed the same design template. The irony was, after all this work, when they made the DVD, while it was, technically a lot better than the '98 DVD, it seemed like the video quality was not that much different in terms of the master used. So this meant that I just always stuck with the '98 DVD and just looked at this for the extras, or if I watched the other scenes, I would just watch it with the Italian mono. Now, the next version that came out is the version that I sold off because I couldn't stand it. But basically, the 2009 Blu-ray debut of the film basically took the 2003 version master. It was HD, but it was riddled with so much digital noise reduction that you had the full-on people with waxy faces syndrome. It just looked terrible. It really was terrible. It had the 5.1 atrocity remix on it, and it was really such a subpar disc that even reviews at the time were like, this is awful, you've got to do better, MGM. So I used to have that. I finally sold it off when I got the 2014 box set because I was like, well, I won't need this anymore. This was before I realized that I should hang on to every version of every Leone film ever made because there's always some difference somewhere. But again, all the extras that you see, the vast majority of them were originally created for this DVD, and it's still always cool to go back to the first disc that the extras were created for. And then again, the aforementioned 2014 release, we finally got a brand new, 4K scan of the original negative of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Unfortunately, with just the same old disc with the first $2 films. But it was released as an exclusive in the 2014 Man with No Name Trilogy box, shown here. This was the first appearance of the new master that was done by the, I always mispronounce this, so please forgive me, but the Leone Ritrovata, I'll just say Ritrovata for short. Ritrovata is the Italian restoration house that has handled many high-profile restorations and unfortunately seems to have this terrible habit of applying their own terrible color gradings to films. So a lot of times when you see a lot of discussion about color grading and color timing not being theatrically accurate, there's a good chance that it probably came through Ritrovata. And the most notable is their release, their master of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is where the film had the beautiful new scan with tons of detail we'd never seen before in home video, but it had been just completely destroyed with this horrendous color grading that really cast the film in a bunch of yellows and blues, but particularly this thick, inescapable yellow tinting. It was, they said they had the original. I'm trying to remember. I think it was the camera operator supervised the transfer. I can't remember which crew member it was. But I really have a hard time believing that because, I saw this and purchased this and put it in my player and I was like, oh my word, what did they do? Like this film has never looked like this ever. I can't look at the negative myself, but I feel I have a pretty decent history with this film, and I was like, even it was just a immediate gut reaction. It's like, what did they do? And the yellow was so prevalent and so bad that it quickly became known as, trying to think of the polite way to put it, but as literally as if someone had gotten up and urinated all over the image. It is just atrocious. And that's, it really hides what is otherwise a great new scan with tons of great detail. And this has been the version that took over as the standard, and is also, again, the 2003 MGM extended version of the film with all the Italian scenes plus the grotto scene and the off of 5.1 remix. It had advertised this as having the original mono, which got me excited. And I'm like, well, at least we might have a cleaner version of the mono, and it's synced on the Blu-ray, and we won't have to deal with the 5.1 anymore. But on this first pressing of this box set, because again, Leone variations never end, and they seemingly can never get these films right. It is actually a down mix of the 5.1 atrocity mix, so you can hear. The only positive of that maybe is if you want to hear the new scenes with Eastwood and Wallach's, English dialogue, and it's folded down to mono, it makes all the changes a bit less obvious. And you could just imagine it's single channel without the extra Foley and stuff, and it's not quite as bad as hearing it in 5.1, but it's still the same awful mix. Eventually, they made a second pressing of this and replaced that with the brand new restored version of the mono that MGM did with, I believe it was Chase Audio who handled that, who does a lot of audio restorative work. Unfortunately, I bought this when it came out, so I have the first pressing with the fold down mono from the 5.1 atrocity mix, and I'm going to keep calling that it because for Leone fans and for historical purposes, it is an atrocity. It's a sonic atrocity, that 5.1 remix. But anyway, this was where the Ritrovata scan first turned up. And you can still find this, and it does contain the original Blu-rays for Fistful and for a few dollars more, so those didn't change. It's just a standard case inside. As you can see, the original dollars discs are there, and then the new GBU disc has the upgraded cover art. Apparently, you can tell the pressing difference if you look at the disc code itself on the underside of the disc. I think it's like a 0.01 or 0.02 for the version with the 2014 restored mono. But unfortunately, that mono doesn't sound very good. I think they didn't have the best source to work from. It sounds kind of tinny, and so even that is not very good. At least it's mono, and it's the original mix, but it still has problems. I should also mention that the MGM Blu-rays did add a few more extras over what was on the 2003 DVD. But the primary thing it added was a commentary track with Sir Christopher Frayling, the biographer and really the lifelong champion of Sergio Leone. And without Frayling, Leone's name would still probably, be not quite ridiculed, but he would not have the level of respect he does now as one of the great cinema artists. Without Frayling's efforts and his absolutely indispensable biography, which is called Something to Do with Death, if you haven't read it yet, and you absolutely must. But anyway, his commentary was saved and put on the Blu-rays. It's been carried over since, but that is the major extra they did add. There are one or two featurettes that were added that have also carried over, but that's what got really added on to the MGM Blu-rays. So GBU is a major catalog title for MGM, so it was really something of surprise in 2017 when they did license it out to Kino Lorber, who apparently won a very large bidding war to get the rights to the film, and so that way it went to Kino instead of some of the other labels like perhaps Criterion, but they did finally bring out their version in 2017, and shown here, which very nicely uses the original US 1 sheet. But this is where the problems really started, even before the release, because a lot of fans, myself included, tried to contact Kino Lorber because everybody just wants this film to finally get a proper release. We want all of Leone's films to have proper video releases with proper picture, proper sound, proper edit, and all the old extras carried over, and to finally get it right, because it seems these films are really cursed in a lot of ways, because not one really has a perfect proper release 100% across the board. But there was a lot of back and forth, and a lot of us who contacted them really felt burned and kind of insulted in some ways, because it was like we're not trying to tell you how to do your job or anything. We're not armchair experts. Some of us really have a lot of history in researching this film, and we all want the same thing. But eventually what happened was Kino did make some concessions and at least make an attempt to fix the massive color problems of the 2014 disc. But unfortunately, it's kind of hard to describe, but what they did was they tried to remove the yellow tinting, but in like a sort of blanket way. So what you have is an example of one step forward, two steps backward. So it results in the same master on disc, but it is noticeably a bit bluer. The yellow cast is removed, but the image looks almost faded in a lot of ways. It's much dimmer. It has the attempt at fixing the color really introduced a lot of issues of its own. So again, it's hard to decide which is better, the 2014 or the 2017 Kino. It was really sort of, they were kind of equal. They each had major issues. So unfortunately, that really caused a lot of color problems of its own. And on top of that, they decided to present two versions of the film. They decided to present the long version, as it's usually called, but the 2003 MGM extended English language version, and what they called the theatrical cut, referring to the 1967 international release version. But unfortunately, what happened was Kino took their master again with the new color issues on top of the old ones, and they cut it down and conformed it to not the international release version and not a print, but the 1998 DVD. And again, myself and others, tried to, say, hey, that's not quite right. The 98 DVD and Laserdisc, they're sort of a cut of their own. They're not the 1967 release version. It's not the theatrical cut. But that just seemingly kind of fell on deaf ears. And what we got on here, as you can see here, one disc is labeled the extended cut, and one disc is labeled the theatrical cut. This means that basically the theatrical cut, as it's called on here, merely takes the Kino master of the extended cut, again with their own color issues, and conformed it to the 1998 DVD. So you essentially get the new master, but re-rendered in the edit of the 1998 DVD. So it is still not the theatrical cut. So each cut of the film presented here in the 2017 release had edit issues of its own. Now on the audio side, again, we have the atrocious 5.1 remix, but they did include the 2014 MGM Chase Audio restored mono track, which again, it is presented lossless, which it was lossy on the MGM second version of the 2014 set. So that was a slight improvement. Again, doesn't sound anywhere near as good as the 1990 Laserdisc PCM, but at least it was a version of the mono, and it was lossless encoded. They also included the Italian mono, and what's great about that, it was also lossless encoded, but if you were to toggle between the two, you could hear how tinny sounding that restored English mono sounds, because the Italian mono sounds much fuller, much better. Not quite as good as what's on the 1990 Laserdisc, but, and of course it's Italian and not the English mono, but you could definitely tell that tinniness was there. They did carry over all the extras. They added a new commentary from Tim Lucas on, again, their theatrical cut disc. But unfortunately, when they brought over the legacy extras, they didn't encode the frame rates right. So unfortunately, all of the old extras dating back to the 2003 DVD release really looked terrible. They were standard def and they were at the wrong frame rate. This went for all the trailers as well. So unfortunately, all of the picture extras on the legacy content was really unwatchable, and you had to rely on your old DVDs and Blu-rays, which of course were all fine. So, and this isn't to bash on Kino or anything, but unfortunately, the 2017 release of the film really represented a major missed opportunity. And it was really kind of a shame because Kino really put a lot of work into promoting this, and again they won the bidding war to be able to put out a special edition of the film, and they tried to do a version of the longer cut on one disc and the supposed theatrical cut on another disc. So it was just really such a shame because again. Those of us who really care about the film and have researched it over many years and talked about it back and forth endlessly and own 500 copies of the film, we all felt a little bit burned because we all want the same thing, and the response wasn't very good. And then really this 27 release was just a compromise everywhere, and it did not work. So of course I purchased it, and then practically I would listen to the Tim Lucas commentary and sample the mono tracks, and then it went back on the shelf with the other 50 copies of the film I own. But yeah, this was it was such a shame that this happened. And then eventually Kino would do a Blu-ray release of Fistful of Dollars, which also has a horrendous Ritrovata color grade applied to it. And then they also did For a Few Dollars More, which is much better. It's not perfect, but it also is not fully complete. It is missing the pieces that are not present in most US versions and are only currently present on the German Blu-ray release, where they were tracked down and reincorporated into the film. So admittedly, that was a bit of a mouthful, and we have finally come full circle to the brand new Kino Lorber second go-around with their 4K and Blu-ray release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the theatrical international 1967 version. And nowhere to be found is the 2003 MGM extended English language version. So this is the slipcover, which apparently has been exhausted, and a lot of people are really regretting they didn't purchase this earlier to try and get a slipcover included. I don't know if Kino is going to print more of these, but apparently now the slipcovers are going for significant amounts on eBay. It's a nice slipcover, and it does have a version of the original U.S. poster art, the traditional Kino style on the back. And then the 4K disc itself, which replicates the same. And then what's nice is that the sleeve itself is reversible with more original art. I'll show you the discs themselves. And of course, this looks quite similar to the 2017 Blu-ray, but that could not be further from the truth, because it is my distinct pleasure to relate and inform those who haven't read any reviews or anything. Kino actually, most surprisingly, took all of the faults of the 2017 release to heart. And while it is still the same source Ritrovata master, they took it upon themselves to reach out to the fans and those who really have done groundbreaking work into researching the history of the film, its various versions, and obtaining various print elements, and really finding things that were either thought lost or were really unknown. So they have conformed the Ritrovata master to the 1967 international release edit of the film, the Sergio Leone approved and signed off on edit of the film that was seen everywhere in 1967. And not only that, they have done pretty extensive color timing adjustments and used original IB Tech scans from original Italian IB Technicolor dye transfer print sources, again sourced from the same fans who have once again gone to many great lengths over many years of trying to yeah, really shed more light onto the entire release history of all of Leone's films, which is work that really had not been done to this extent by anyone ever. But this is 100% the 1967 international release version. And on top of that, they actually did use several instances where they did use frames and shots from those dye transfer original Technicolor 1967 prints to actually fully recreate the international release version, which of course that's really the only way to do that, to make sure it is 100% correct, because all previous video versions are missing something somewhere. I'll get into the actual specs in just a second, but I just wanted to lead off with that because that was such an enormous surprise. It carries over all of the extras on the previous release, except for those that are synced to the extended version. So you do not have the Richard Schickel or Christopher Frayling commentaries on here, but if you do own the earlier releases on Blu-ray, you will have those as well. So, definitely hang on to your older discs to have every last extra. But everything else does carry over. They did fix the frame rate issues on the MGM DVD extras, it seems, because I did check some of those. Of course, I've seen them 1,000 times by this point, because, again, they date back to the 2003 DVD. So those those are watchable now. It does seem like the trailers still have that frame rate issue. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was just missed because they do kind of run slow. So that's unfortunate, but that's really. I hate to say it's a nitpick because I love trailers, but it could be worse. Beggars can't be choosers. But they did at least fix the frame rate problems on the MGM extras, which was a major issue on the 2017 release. On the extras front, again, I just want to highlight, because I had even forgotten how good of a track it was, the Tim Lucas commentary that carries over from the 2017 release, because that was done for their version of the 1998 DVD edit, which in terms of runtime is very close to the international cut. So they were able to sync Tim Lucas's commentary from the 2017 disc to the new 2021 release. But it's an excellent commentary track. It is well worth listening to, extremely informative and very well done in a very laid back manner. And I hadn't listened to it since 2017. I had forgotten how good of a track it was. So it was a nice experience to revisit it for this release. And of course, he went on to do tracks for Kino's release of Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. So excellent track, and well worth the price of admission if you haven't heard it yet or you didn't listen to it on the 2017 release. The Blu-ray is the same as the 4K disc, so they are both the brand new version of the 1967 international release version. Now, again, this does use the Ritrovata master, and with extensive color timing, gets you extraordinarily close to the look and appearance of an IB dye transfer print of the film, which does have a slightly different look and feel than what you're used to on home video, because all the Leone films have a slightly flatter look on their older video releases, again, not counting the Ritrovata 2014 disc and the Kino 2017 disc. But it is really remarkable how much, because it was a beautiful transfer underneath all the color grading originally. But it is really remarkable the turnaround that's been done with this same master that we've all had sitting on the shelf for years now that nobody could really stand. Again, it is very, very close to a dye transfer print. It's not perfect because unfortunately some issues are baked into the master. It kind of reminds me of Warner Archive and their Horror of Dracula release, how they were forced to regrade the really poorly colored 2007 BFI remaster of the film And they did get the color right, but because the issues baked into the master caused some issues and made the image have a lot of loss of shadow detail, and really all the edges were almost blacked out. But that was an issue they couldn't really get around because it was stuff baked into the source master. Here, there's nothing quite that bad. If you were to look at the Blu-rays side by side, you will notice that there's a little loss in shadow detail in this version. But again, it is much more akin to what you would see on an original dye transfer release print or any release print of the film. But again, the color work is absolutely beautiful. It is amazing to see the film look finally much more like itself again. And the 4K version makes slight improvements with the greater codecs and, of course, on a 4K disc. But again, it does not have an HDR pass done on it. So there's been a lot of people sort of bemoaning the fact that it's still standard dynamic range. But again, this is a master that's dating back to, at least 2014 now. So it's quite possible it was never designed with HDR in mind, and HDR is a very expensive process. Apparently, Kino even thought about maybe doing a brand new restoration, a brand new scan from scratch to get away from Ritrovata's stuff, which is something I still hope might happen at some point. Again, if we were to dream about the absolute perfect release, it would be to finally get away from this master. But again, that's a very expensive prospect, and Kino is a smaller boutique label, and they have limited budget, and they have so many other discs and titles they're doing, they can't really afford to do that. Because, of course, that type of budget would require not just a fistful of dollars, but a few dollars more as well. That was a terrible joke. I do apologize, but I couldn't resist. So what they did was basically on this release put their best foot forward, I think is the best way to describe this, and did their darndest to fix as much of the color issues they could in the source Ritrovata master and fully conform the edit of this master to the 1967 release version, right down to incorporating IB Tech dye transfer non-fade shots and frames to fully recreate the 1967 version, which goes beyond what was even on the 1990 Laserdisc. So this has those shots that were missing from even that disc, which prior to this was the only way to see the release version of the film as intended. Again, with those unfortunate minor shots being gone. So again, it's not perfect. In a perfect world, it would be great to get away from this master finally, but they really did the job right this time. This really does make up for the 2017 disc not really being any good at all. This is what myself and a lot of other fans really kind of hoped for the first go around. So it's been a really phenomenal, incredible surprise that Kino acknowledged this and did this second version. Of course, a lot of people are disappointed. Again, the 4K does not have HDR, and a lot of people are disappointed that this does not feature a version of the extended cut of the film they're now used to. But this really is more from an archival standpoint, because, of course, there was no extended English language version originally. There was only the Italian version on the theatrical release that was longer. And, of course, different versions in different territories. But for the most part, the rest of the world saw the international version, which is finally recreated here. So it would be great if we could have gotten the same process done to recreate the Italian release version, which still has not really been done on home video because, of course, even foreign editions have issues of their own. But what they did do was include all of the additional scenes on the disc as well. Unfortunately, they are only on the 4K disc. They are not on the Blu-ray disc, which does have all of the extras on it. So that is something that's not necessarily the clearest in a lot of reviews and the press announcements. But if you do want to watch those scenes again, you can watch them. They are on this release, but they are on the 4K UHD disc itself. And of course, separate from the film. They are not incorporated into the film any longer. So really, this undoes a lot of the damage MGM did back in 2003. And for the first time on home video, we have the 1967 release version, the international cut, in its entirety, 100%, with those shots that were missing from the 1990 Laserdisc. And finally, we have a proper version of the film to replace the, really, for lack of a better term, the god awful 2003 inaccurate extended version with all of its problems and the awful sound remix. Two other things I would say about the picture quality when you're watching this new transfer, or I should say this new version of the Ritrovata transfer, because it's still, of course, the same base master. You may spot, of course, depending on how eagle-eyed you may be, you may spot one or two tiny hairs in the gate and one or two spots, but those are baked into the Ritrovata master. They have been there since the master first appeared on disc in 2014. So if you went and looked at the 2014 MGM Blu-ray or either disc of the Kino Lorber 2017 first version on Blu-ray, you will find those in the same spot. There is, honestly, when they're minor like that, there's almost something a little bit endearing, because it does bring to mind that it is a physical process and things can get missed. But it's kind of strange they've made it through all this time. But again, they are very minor. It's just one or two that I happen to notice. I'd actually forgotten they were there because I rarely would go back and watch the 2014 or 2017 discs. But those were there, and I had to remind myself and go look at the other discs again. What I have noticed in some discussions already, and usually pops up with the Leone films in particular, is people noticing how grainy they look and that they have a particular style to them. And that is really down to the fact that they were, of course, shot in Techniscope, which was the process developed by Technicolor as a means of making a scope format available to, shall we say, film productions more on a budget. It was generally referred to as the poor man's CinemaScope. And of course, what this did to achieve a scope image was to literally use two perforations of the general 4 perforation 35 millimeter film frame image of the full camera aperture. And so by basically cutting the frame in half and squeezing 2 images onto the space that would normally be 1 frame of image on a piece of 35 millimeter film, which by measuring the side perforations on the side of the film itself, you usually measure a typical single image at 4 perforations. Well, Techniscope crammed an image in on the space of 2 perforations. So if you look at a Techniscope film and a standard film side by side, you would notice that there are seemingly double the amount of images. And by squeezing them in there, it literally conforms them to something akin to a 235 scope anamorphic shape, but of course they're not anamorphic. And because they are sharing the same piece of film, that does cut down on your resolution. Some people go as far as to say that it's almost like 16 millimeter. It does increase the graininess of the image, which is why you do see a wonderful amount of natural grain in this transfer, which you didn't really get on prior home video versions until the Ritrovata Master first appeared in 2014. But it is supposed to be there. It's not something that's out of place. Techniscope also had to require specially made custom optical conversions back in the day to make standard 4 per 35 millimeter prints from the Techniscope negative, which means it, while it is cheap and you save half the costs of film stock when you use Techniscope, especially back in the 1960s, you had to depend on your lab making the prints and doing the processing, and you had to depend on them being good at their job, basically, which didn't always happen, and you could get very bad Techniscope conversion prints made. So there's been a lot of strides with modern technology and tools, which means a lot of modern scans can really improve on even original release prints in terms of clarity and sharpness. So it is really beautiful to see this transfer finally looking more like it should without all the awful color grading applied to it. But again, a lot of stuff that people will see on this transfer and maybe think, hey, that looks a little weird, or what's going on here? Why does it look this particular way? Again, you do have to understand the constraints and the particular quirks of Techniscope, which really in a lot of ways also artistically freed Leone and others who used Techniscope as a means to achieve their artistic goals, because of course, because they didn't have to use anamorphic lenses to achieve a scope image. They could use spherical lenses, and Leone really realized this on A Fistful of Dollars, and that's how he was able to really develop his trademark technique of using very wide shots alternated with extreme close-ups and keep remarkable clarity and focus and sharpness, because of course spherical lenses don't have the fall off that anamorphic lenses do. Had they been shooting in a version of CinemaScope with anamorphic lenses, like Leone actually did on his first film, Colossus of Rhodes, he would not have been able to develop his style. You see inklings of it in Colossus of Rhodes, but you also see a few places where Leone is, going beyond what he can do, and there are some places where you get distortions and things. He actually does one point, there's a 360-degree pan that really foreshadows what you get in the Ecstasy of Gold sequence. It's by no means anywhere near as elaborate, but it's cool and amazing to see he was already playing with things like that, even in his first movie. But again, he was going way beyond what the technology could achieve, because of course, that film was shot in a variant of, I should say, an almost unbranded variant of CinemaScope, and had scope distortions built into the lens. So when he does that shot, it's in a crypt, and the camera pans 360 degrees. You do see the walls kind of distort, which he does use artistically, but it's sort of prefacing what he does in the Ecstasy of Gold sequence, where eventually things do distort when Tuco is running around and all of the tombstones start to blend into one another. So now we come to the audio portion of this review, and this is something that is really just as important as the picture, and something that's gotten completely glossed over in most reviews and most discussion of this disc, because it's not really trumpeted anywhere on the release or in the extras and things. Just as the actual usage of IB Tech frames and shots is not as well, or that this is fully recreating the 1967 international release version. There's a lot of minutiae here that unfortunately a lot of people aren't going to get. So that was really the reason why I wanted to get this review out pretty quickly after I received the disc and was able to go through it and stuff, because there is a lot of confusion that's sort of floating around. But the audio is very interesting, because what they did was there's a 5.1 track and there's a mono track yet again, and most people assume it's what was on here before. But what you have to know about this disc is that, again, just ignore the 5.1, go straight for the mono, because that's how these films were intended to be experienced. But this is not the 2014 MGM Chase Audio restored mono that sounds kind of tinny that was on the previous Blu-rays, nor is it a fold down of the 5.1 terrible mix that we have been saddled with since 2003. What this is something I've already talked about, and it is making a return appearance. And for me, being a Laserdisc geek, this is really something that is not only enjoyable for me and just the thought that other people will be able to experience this, but it's one of the Laserdisc audio tracks I have sworn up and down for years that people need to experience, because there is no better sounding version I've encountered. So what the mono track on here is the Laserdisc 16-bit PCM English language mono track. It was sourced from the Laserdisc. It was provided by the same fans who did the print scans and things, because for all intents and purposes, the English language mono on the Laserdisc PCM is the best available and best sounding source track for the English mono that is known anywhere in the world. There is no better sounding mono than the Laserdisc mono. And this is something that's rather interesting, because then it becomes a question: is it just, is the source lost in the vaults? Do people not know where it is? Did it deteriorate? Did it get thrown out? There's no telling. And in the Laserdisc era, it's very common to source master materials or magnetic tracks and, copy them over to the video master, because LDs were, using PCM at CD quality, 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz, exactly the same as a CD. So really, it's like a time capsule for audio, and they weren't doing intensive audio remixing or EQing or noise reduction and such at quite not yet at this time. So that's why Laserdisc quite often does have a superior audio track, particularly on catalog titles. But with GBU, I noticed that right off the bat when I got into LD and I started looking for the Leone titles. And of course, I started by thinking the 98 version would be the best version to go for, but by that time they had already tried to clean the audio, and it is noticeably not as good. So it's just amazing that that's on here, and it literally is the LD track, and it is properly synced, and it is there. It's not been changed around. I double checked. I literally ran my Laserdisc copies and the Blu-ray like I usually do all the time when I do comparisons. I did a rough synchronization so I could toggle back and forth. It is the Laserdisc audio. The levels are the same. So finally, the rest of the world, without a Laserdisc player, will be able to enjoy the much richer and much clearer mono audio track because it is literally the Laserdisc audio, and it has finally been sourced directly from the Laserdisc itself. It is lossless. It is encoded as DTS HDMA, so it is a straight transfer. It's still the same 16-bit, so that's of course why it's not a 24-bit audio track. This is the version of the film's audio that has the most clarity. You will notice a great difference, a distinct difference in the clarity of the audio track if you have not, even if you're a great fan of the film, you've seen it 1,000 times. If you have not seen the film on Laserdisc with the digital audio track, this will be a real treat sonically for you as well. So in addition to the great improvements in picture and finally presenting the 1967 international release version of the film, we have the best presentation of the film's original monaural mix in the English mono that is currently available. And it's just astounding that this is on here. And admittedly, it's a little bit of vindication for me because I've sworn up and down for years, and I've told so many people they have to track down the 1990 GBU LD or the box set version because that's, the closest to the international version, because it's only missing one or two shots, and it's got the best sounding version of the English mono. The Leone films aren't tinny sounding mono; they are very full and rich mono tracks. So that is just as important as the new color timing on here. So, and it's not advertised anywhere. And what's really killed me is a lot of reviews have just said, "Oh, the audio is fine. It's the same as what's before." And it's like, no, it isn't. It really isn't. You have no idea. We're so lucky that this finally has brought in the best available version of the English mono. So that is just as important. It's one of the most important things about this release. Now, I guess I should go ahead and talk about the 5.1 mix that is on this disc a little bit more because it is actually a real surprise. It's not credited anywhere, but it is actually seemingly a brand new 5.1 track in terms of it was specially created for this release. This isn't trumpeted anywhere. It's not in the press release. It's not anywhere on the jacket, just like it does talk about having the Laserdisc mono. But what this 5.1 track is, I was very surprised. I flicked over to it just for a minute, just to look at it for a second, because I assumed it would be a version of that 2003 Abominable remix, because that is the only discrete version of the film in terms of it being a multiple discrete channel mix. I immediately noticed the awful 2003 Foley effects weren't there, the brand new gunshots weren't there, the stereo panning wasn't there, and all that stuff. And it sounded like the mono, and I'm like, this is kind of bizarre. What's going on here? And after a lot of toggling back and forth and making sure my ears weren't playing tricks on me, what they actually seemingly have done is they took the LD mono track and actually upmixed it to 5.1. So it's the same. It's literally the same track. I sat there and compared back and forth, and the levels are a little bit lower because it's now spread across these 6 channels. But what they did was they upmixed the mono to 5.1, and like even other Leone titles have had done, like Once Upon a Time in America. And when you upmix mono to 5.1, it's basically spreading it around the room. It's filling the rear channels with a little bit of ambiance and filtering out any low end to your subwoofer through the LFE track. But basically, when you have the mono upmixes to 5.1 and they don't change anything and they don't add a bunch of panning and stuff, it's basically just, it's kind of hard to describe, but they're basically putting some air in it and letting it breathe in a home theater environment. And while I don't really have any use for tracks like this, when the original is still included and the 5.1 is an alternate, I think it is the perfect way to try and appease those who really want to give their home theater a workout and they always want a discrete option if it is available for multi-track audio. So for those who really are not mono fans, who have home theaters, who do want a discrete multi-channel soundtrack, this is a viable option finally, because it doesn't have the atrocious sound remix design that ruins the original design that Leone supervised and helped create. The original sound effects are here. And again, it's basically upmixing the original mono, and it is exactly the same Laserdisc mono, because again, you can toggle them back and forth, and you'll notice it's the same source audio, but it's now spread across in a 5.1 channel configuration. So that means it's still pretty much center locked. Everything's going to be focused around the center, but now you have extra ambiance coming from your left to right surround. You have a wider front stage with your left and right channels, and you have a little bit of emphasis with the LFE track as well. So again, it's just expanding it into a 5.1 configuration, and I was totally surprised. I wasn't even going to bother checking the 5.1 because I assumed wrongly that it was dating back to the MGM 2003 mix. So that was another surprise. It was something they didn't have to do, and ideally they wouldn't have to bother with a multi-channel version at all, because again, this film was always mono and has always been mono. But if you have to go down that path and you are somebody who really wants a multi-channel version of the film, this is about as good as you can do without really ripping apart the sound design. So again, it's unnecessary, but for those who really want that multi-channel experience, that this is also the one for you. And again, it was a very nice surprise that there is no version of the terrible audio on here, and that they actually went to the trouble of doing a 5.1 upmix of the Laserdisc mono. So what this does, all this stuff, and also bringing in all the legacy extras and things, even though it doesn't have the two commentaries that are locked to the 2003 extended version, and it doesn't have a version of the Italian longer theatrical cut, this is the single best home video release that the film has ever had, and it is the first and only time that the original 1967 international release version, what people saw in theaters and saw in reissues for years and decades afterwards, has ever been on home video, because of course, again, the 1990 Laserdisc is missing a couple shots, so this even improves on that. Again, in a perfect world, we could have both versions of the film in 4K with HDR and stuff, and have the Italian theatrical version properly presented on disc as well, and have a brand new scan and master done, getting away from the Ritrovata master entirely. But again, we have limited budgets to work with, and we have real world constraints, and reality is a factor. So again, it's nice to come up with dream releases, but it's not always the practical or possible thing to do. So at the current time where we are now with the film, with the elements that are available, this really is Kino doing the best they possibly can with what is available and the budget they have. And it's just absolutely astounding that we have this release now. And so now there's finally a release that somebody can actually go and purchase, and take the shrink wrap off, and there's no problems. There's no problems with the edit. There's no problems with the color. There's no problems with the sound. It is the best possible presentation of the English mono. It has the majority of the legacy extras on here, again, without the two extended commentaries. So, and they did fix the frame rate on the MGM Legacy extras. I'm amazed we even have this. I really am. But it was a shock when they announced it, and the more details have leaked out, and then actually getting it in my hands and going through this thing, and just it's been a long time coming. It really has, and particularly for Leone fans and people like myself who have really invested a lot of time into not just adoring the films and studying them and studying Leone's craft and his artistry, but also the admittedly very few of us who have really entrenched ourselves in the release history and trying to understand the versions of the film and how it is best possible to try and properly present these films and do the research and gather materials together and own an untold number of Leone films across different formats and have just a Leone shelf in your home library. That's why this release is so important. This disc is a must-own, even if you're like me and you're not fully 4K ready and stuff, and even if you're a big 4K enthusiast and you're like, well, it doesn't have HDR, I don't need to bother with it because 4K is all about HDR. That's true and that's fine and all, but this recent release is still that important. It is really the best the film has ever looked on home video. It addresses as many of the color problems as can be done from the Ritrovata Master. Again, it's not 100% perfect because a lot of that stuff is baked in there, but it's like 90% there. I mean, it is really close. You put this on just to sample it, you watch the whole feature. You cannot turn it off. And again, with the Laserdisc English language mono on here, properly synchronized, it is the best audio presentation of the film that has ever been around and the best one that exists anywhere in the known world. So you have that as well. It is a complete package. It's an astonishing release. It is a release I never thought would happen in a million years, as evidenced by the whole spiel it took for me to even explain why this release is so important. So it's kind of unfortunate that this stuff isn't as discussed and it's not as well known, and I feel like I'm having to try and put this stuff out there so people are more aware of not just the differences in the cuts but also the archival importance of this disc, which is just so vastly important. It's really the most important part of this release is that from an archival standpoint this is finally acceptable. It's just amazing we have this, and I really must say a great thank you to Kino Lorber for not only giving this a second try, but actually, acknowledging the stuff that happened on the 2017 release and going to the fans and saying, hey, what can we do? We want to try and do it right this time. And again, with practicalities and everything as a factor, that they couldn't go and make a brand new master and start completely from scratch, which would take, again, a whole lot of dollars more. It wouldn't just take a few dollars more. It would take many, many, many dollars more. But, all that aside, they really did their best, and it results in, again, the single best version of the film ever on home video. Again, while I wish in a perfect world we could have the Italian version fully restored and the international version fully restored in 4K with HDR, hopefully that can happen at some point in the future. But it remains, as of now, this is the version to own. It is absolutely essential if you're any fan of this film, or Sergio Leone, or Westerns, or home video. If this sounds appealing to you in any way, just go ahead and buy it. It is absolutely staggering that we finally have the international release version with the proper English mono on disc in your hands at home, and you can finally watch the film again without any major issues in color or edit or sound. And you're finally seeing the version of the film that Sergio Leone intended international audiences to see in 1967, the version he personally edited, supervised, and signed off on, which again The only time you could see something close to that before was all the way back in 1990 on the original letterbox laserdisc release, which again was missing a shot or two, so it wasn't 100% perfect, but it was like 99.9% there. And of course, the audio on this release is here on the 4K release on the mono. So as you can tell, I have a little bit of a personal attachment to this film and Sergio Leone's work in general. To end this with just a little bit of personal history and why this is so important to me personally, I first encountered the film way back, and of course, doesn't sound very much way back because I was not born during the original release of the film, so I couldn't see it theatrically in 1967, obviously. So I first encountered the film sometime in about probably 2001 or so. It was about 10 or 11 at the time. Not the way to see it. It was the 1998 version. It was pan and scanned, and it was on cable. Even with all those constraints, I was so completely sucked into the film, and it was really the film that helped opened the Western genre to me, because of course before that, like most people, I thought it was very cliche ridden and had kind of been done to death and things. But Leone's view of the American West and the American imagined West and the Western as a genre and his eternal hopes for it are here in spades, along with his innate love of history. And it really was the film that not only introduced me to Sergio Leone and the idea of Italian westerns, but also really made westerns much more approachable for me. And then of course I became a rabid Leone nerd and western nerd, as many things as I could get my hands on I would just devour. Shortly thereafter, MGM announced the extended version was coming, and I'd seen the Italian scenes on the 1998 DVD release once I finally got to rent it. And so I was so excited for this. So the first version I technically owned and purchased was the 2003 extended DVD. And the first time I experienced the horrendous sound mix, which I then experienced in a theater as well. And that became a sort of core moment for me. There's a couple moments that really sent me off on this path of not just being a film historian and a film nerd and a cinephile and an aspiring director and writer and everything, but also researching films' technical history, their production history, and their video release history. There's a couple key titles that got me off on that tangent, which has become ever increasing since. One, of course, was the 2004 Star Wars DVD release. One was the 2006 James Bond Ultimate Editions done by Lowry Digital with their issues. But really, the one that helped to cement all of this was the issues surrounding the 2003 GBU extended English language version, what MGM did, the issues that caused in picture and sound and the edit, and then also looking at the two versions at the time and understanding why I preferred the shorter version, even though there are scenes in the from the Italian version that I do wish had been kept. I still understood why Leone cut them on the international version, because it improved the film's pacing and its narrative focus overall, even though there are some great gems in those scenes. So I've been doing this for quite some time, and actually the first time I ever wrote into a studio was over some of these concerns, and I was a very earnest teenager, but I wrote to MGM and got my first basic sort of rejection letter. Thank you for contacting us. Please don't contact us again. We don't want to know. You're just some crazy person writing us. The standard rejection letter. But I wrote to them about The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and the extended English language version, and why did they put the grotto scene in when it wasn't really intended to be there, and why did they do this to the audio, and why could they not present the English mono, and why was the what I thought at the time was the theatrical version, but of course was the 1998 version. Why was that being suppressed now? Things like that. So yeah, my first letter to a studio about films was about GBU in 2003. I think I was about 12 and a half at the time, so I don't think I had turned 13 quite yet. This has been quite an adventure for me. I've been doing this for a number of years. Um, I just wanted to put that at the end of this video because, of course, this is a little bit long, and I will, of course, be sure to put timestamps in so you can just skip to the review part. But there's so much ground to cover, and again, I've been doing this for a little while, and even all these years later, there's always new information that seems to come to the attention of Leone fans, and another new variation appears, or we've had lost scenes and materials not just appear in still form, but actual footage has been discovered and found, which is why the 2 bits of additional footage were scanned and discovered and originally placed on some of the earlier Blu-rays and also are found here as well. Because, of course, before, just a couple years ago, those were thought to be myths, or I didn't even know of some of them even existing. So this is an ever continuing process. Leone's films are not easy to understand in terms of their release versions. And again, it seems like just when you think you know everything, some other variation appears, some variable comes around, and you're like, I got to add that to the list and start all over again. So it's really amazing we have this release. I've been researching Leone again since I really encountered GBU, devouring anything I can get my hands on, and of course, once I discovered the magic of the internet and forums and message boards and being able to interact with other fans, being on the Sergio Leone web board for a number of years, and other forums and things, this has been something myself and a lot of other people have worked on. Of course, a great deal of credit must go to the primary fans in the Sergio Leone community who have spearheaded all of the research into the film and compiling every bit of material, every scrap of film they could possibly get their hands on. Oh, heck, I'm just going to say it. So they are Benji and Jordan Krug, who actually just recently did a podcast episode on the Film Formerly podcast with the 2 guys at Sad Hill Media, who were the guys who were already working on trying to do their own recolor timed version of the Ritrovata Master, and they were the ones who got interviewed and got that wonderful article that started making the rounds in the national media, and really started to get the GBU story out to more people and got people talking about it, which I'm sure is probably what instigated Kino into deciding to come back and take another stab at GBU and try and do Leone in the 4K realm, which they had teased before with a 4K dollars trilogy release that they then pulled the plug on a little while ago. So basically what happened is Kino got in touch with the guys at Sad Hill Media and got in touch with Benji and Jordan, and between everybody, it basically this whole process furthered the cause, and it's so important to get this information out there because, again, we're all after the same thing, and the more people we can have involved, the more that people know that these issues are out there, the better off we're all going to be. And again, while this is the best release we've ever gotten for the film, it is not the be-all, end-all. There is room for improvement, and hopefully one day we can improve even on this release and finally do a new scan entirely, and also try and actually properly recreate the Italian release version, and not a English language hodgepodge of different things that purports to be the Italian theatrical release version when in fact it is not that at all. So again, there is room for improvement, and it is important for people to know that and to not look at maybe a few of the limitations of this release and the Ritrovata Master and start pointing fingers and saying, well, this is a problem, that's a problem. that stuff is inherent to this because, of course, they are still having to work off of the Ritrovata master. So hopefully, if sales are strong for this release, in which it seems they already are, not only can Kino perhaps follow up with a similar 4K release for a fistful of dollars, for a few dollars more, fingers crossed, maybe tackle some of the many issues that plague DocuSucker still to this day, which also desperately needs a new transfer. You know, it might be possible that we might finally be able to do a new transfer of GBU at some point, and also properly recreate the Italian release version. So again, this is not the end of the road. You know, there's still room for improvement. We still have places we can go, but for the time being, we finally have a proper version on disc of the original theatrical release version with the proper English mono track, and really this helps to wash away the bitter taste of the 2017 Kino release. So in the description below, I will link to all kinds of relevant websites and information and articles. I will link to the Film Formerly podcast, so you will actually be able to hear Jordan and Benji talk in great detail about all of the materials they've compiled and all of the vast amount of work they've done throughout the years. I like to think that maybe I've helped a little bit in terms of just discussing this stuff back and forth with them at various points. Of course, what I may have contributed is absolutely minuscule compared to the just mammoth task they have achieved over the years, and something they continue to pursue. So my hat is off to them as always. They are the real experts on not just GBU, but Leone's work in general, and the ways that his films have just completely diversified throughout different countries and different versions throughout the decades. And again, just when you think things are over, there's something else that comes out of the woodwork. It's just incredible that finally we have something to show for it, you know, with this release. So again, while it's not, you know, the dream release we all would want, with the Italian version fully restored and from a brand new scan and everything, and not having any Ritrovata master in it whatsoever, and having HDR and the 4K and stuff, it is the best that can be done really at this time. And it's just amazing we have this. Again, thank you so very much to Kino Lorber for taking another stab at this film, really doing it justice this time. This is really what we all hoped for in 2017, and it took a little while, but we did get there, and it's just amazing we have this. And again, Kino went the extra mile and provided a 4K version, so you get the nice improvements of having a UHD presentation of this new version of the film, which again is finally giving us the 1967 international release edit with the best available version of the English mono, losslessly encoded. This is a must-own disc. Even if you're on the fence, please do yourself a favor, go ahead and purchase this. You will not be disappointed. And again, even if you do prefer one of the longer versions of the film or the 2003 MGM version, you can still hang on to your older disc. It is still available on other releases, and of course you will have to hang on to those for the other commentaries and the couple extras that didn't make it over to this, because of course this is not dealing with the extended English language version from 2003. You see, there's two kinds of people in this world, my friend. Those with loaded guns, and those who dig. You dig. $200,000 is a lot of money. We're gonna have to earn it. With this release, Kino Lorber has earned the respect of Leone fans everywhere. So again, I know I've said it several times. Thank you, Kino Lorber, for doing this. This is, again, just I'm absolutely speechless. This is a disc I never thought would happen. So if I haven't convinced you by now that this disc is a must-own and absolutely essential for any film collection or any Leone fan shelf or any Western fan, then just let me say once again, please do yourself a favor and get a copy of this so you can experience the proper 1967 international release version for yourself, with the advantage of having the best possible presentation of the English language mono sourced from the original 1990 Laserdisc. All right, last thing I swear. So in a lot of ways, this release finally rights some of the great wrongs done to this film on home video for the past, really now not just the past few years, but the past few decades. So with that, thank you so very much for watching, and please do go ahead and purchase this sooner than later if you are a Leone fan, because of course Kino is kind of hinting that they use this as a testing of the waters in terms of following this up with a 4K release of A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, hopefully with the same level of corrections applied, so we can finally get 100% proper transfers of the other $2 films to recreate their theatrical experience with the best available mono elements and incorporating the missing footage into For a Few Dollars More. So that does it for this particular review, and now I have to go and put all my respective GBUs back on their shelf.